Hello, this is Andy Edwards, and today I want to be looking at the solo albums by the English guitarist John McLaughlin. Now, John McLaughlin's probably most well known for playing with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and I've done a ranking of the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums elsewhere if you want to have a look at that. Today I'm going to be looking at his solo albums and a few other collaborations he's done. I won't be looking at the albums he did with Miles Davis, which I'm going to look at in the future, and I won't be discussing at length the albums with Tony Williams' Lifetime, because I'm going to be doing that elsewhere as well. But we need to say that as well as the Mahavishnu Orchestra, the work he did with Miles and Tony Williams is legendary. So this is why getting a sort of overview of John McLaughlin as an artist can be quite difficult, and there's a lot of stuff. I'm probably going to do this in two parts. So I'm going to look at the sort of early albums up until the mid-80s, and then I'll look at the later albums in another video. So who was John McLaughlin? John McLaughlin, jazz fusion guitarist from Yorkshire. He actually, his professional career starts in the early 60s in London, where he's doing two things really. He's working as a session guitarist, playing with people like Petula Clark and Tom Jones and David Bowie and the Rolling Stones. He's a virtuoso guitarist. His influences are jazz, but also flamenco, blues. So he can cover a lot of ground. He's a very, very good reader, virtuoso musician. So he starts working in London in the early 60s. Doing session work, and he's working alongside other guitarists like Jimmy Page, and he's working in the same world as people like Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck. He's basically in London when a whole host of musicians are really creating rock music and also progressive rock music, and the way they're doing that is by fusing different styles together. So John McLaughlin is really involved in fusing the blues with jazz, with soul, with pop music, rock music, and this is something that isn't considered about John McLaughlin. When he emerges with the Mahavishnu Orchestra in 1971, he's actually had 11 years working in the business already, and actually working in perhaps one of the most creative scenes in the history of rock music, which was London through the 60s. So before we go into solo albums, I just want to, if you want to explore that, it can get quite difficult. There's quite a lot of albums where he's playing session on. On the session albums, he's not hired as a lead guitarist. He's often playing rhythm guitar. But he's also working with people like Georgie Fame, Brian Auger, and Graham Bond. Now these have got a whole host of musicians with them, people like Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. And McLaughlin's working with those right at the beginnings of rock music being developed, so this is from rock and roll turning into rock music. And I think we'd all agree that bands like Cream were very, very important in the development of rock music. Well, John McLaughlin was working with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker before Cream. In fact, there's some recordings with Duffy Power he did, which got released on an album, I think it's called Innovations. It was released in the 70s. But when you go back to there, you can see that John McLaughlin is really ahead of the pack in what he's doing at that time in terms of rock music. But an album to check out this early 60s period would be this one, Graham Bond. What's it called? Solid Bond, is it? Yeah, Solid Bond. That's a great album that sort of represents John McLaughlin in England in the 60s. Another one which I pulled out, if you just want to check out the early John McLaughlin, would be Things We Like by Jack Bruce. And both these albums, you really get to hear them solo. This is later, this is 1968, and you can sort of hear John McLaughlin's style emerging, which is a mixture of sort of jazz virtuosity, but mixed with sort of the blues, rock guitar, bits of Eric Clapton, bits of Hendrix. If you check out some of the early recordings at this time where John McLaughlin's playing jazz, it's quite surprising at that time what an advanced jazz guitarist he is, and how on the recordings he does early on, he sort of is playing that down, and this is really where you hear McLaughlin solving how to be an electric guitarist playing rock and jazz and fusing those two things together. Now, just before he went to the States, to go and play with Tony Williams' Lifetime and play on albums like In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew with Miles, he did record his first solo album. Now this here, I consider to be a masterpiece. Extrapolation by John McLaughlin. There's nothing really in the recordings of John McLaughlin before this where you really get to hear what he did with this. I think the fact that John McLaughlin went on to so much success actually has diminished the reputation of this album, because the Mahavishnu Orchestra sold so many copies, you know, that I think the jazz elite in Britain especially, who have always been a bit snobby, look down on the fusion players. And so this album doesn't get his due, its due, I think. But on this, John McLaughlin is combining rock and jazz and also free improvisation. He was really involved in a lot of free improvisation at this time. And it's just a really interesting album. You really see the seeds of fusion on this album. And a lot of people acknowledge it as being fantastic, but I just don't think it gets the full things it deserves, really. So if you're want to get into McLaughlin, this is almost essential. You really hear the seeds of the Mahavishnu Orchestra on this. In fact, there's certain tracks that end up as Mahavishnu tracks later on. The players on it are absolutely incredible. Tony Oxley's, which is a free jazz drummer, really. It does some incredible drumming. John Sermon on saxophone, absolutely brilliant. I think who's on bass on this? Brian Hodges, who is stepping in, if I remember rightly, for David Holland, who is another British musician who I think had gone over to America to play with Miles earlier than John McLaughlin. I think it's arguable that David Holland and John McLaughlin are two of the most important British jazz musicians that's ever been. I think John McLaughlin I would rate as, I can't think of a more influential, important British jazz musician than John McLaughlin. And yet, do the critics say that? You know, where are the statues? Where's the commemoration to John McLaughlin in this country and in England, my country, for him as a guitar player? You don't see that anyway. So yes, this really incredible album. He follows that up, right? His second album was recorded in the States. So Extrapolation's recorded in I think it's 68, early 69. He goes to the States. He plays with Miles Davis on In a Silent Way, which brings him out to a much wider audience. He starts jamming around the scene there, and he gets picked up by Alan Douglas, and he's signed up to do this album, Devotion. I never know quite which way round it goes. I think I can't tell. I think that's the way around it is. Yeah, John McLaughlin, Devotion, and this is completely unlike Extrapolation. This is very, very psychedelic. Sort of somewhere between the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Jimi Hendrix's Band of Gypsies group, I've always thought. John McLaughlin's since disowned this. I think partly is because of the deal he got with Alan Douglas, which was for 2 albums that he got a pittance for. But also, from what I remember, it was really edited and mixed, and there was stuff added to it. When behind sort of John McLaughlin's back, he'd gone off and then he heard it. I'm a big fan of this album. I love this album, and most people who love this album love all the stuff that was done, all the psychedelic stuff. It's a really trippy, weird album. And what is it? When was this made? 1970. It's really got to go down again as one of the early fusion albums. I mean, people talk about, you know, Jack Johnson, which I think was recorded at the same time of this, but this is proper jazz fusion. It's rock music and jazz combined. Really fantastic album. So these first 2 albums are essential purchases if you want to get into John McLaughlin. His third solo album, again, is another masterpiece in my opinion, which is this, My Goals Beyond. I haven't got the original cover here. You can see this is the Electro Musician re-release that came out in the early 80s. So on this, and I think they swap around the sides on this. So on this side 1 is all the acoustic guitar, solo acoustic guitar tunes that he hit. So the side 1 is all solo acoustic guitar. So he's really, he's sort of, those sort of albums, the solo albums that ECM made, like Ralph Towner, Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea, you know, where you would get a solo artist making an album or just of them on the instrument. John McLaughlin's sort of ahead of the game again on this. And of course, these are very, very influential. I think, it was Jeff Beck, when he heard this was what alerted him to John McLaughlin's guitar playing. It is so virtuoso on these acoustic tracks. The other side, which on here is side 2, I'm pretty sure on the original it was side 1, has got 2 pieces called piece 1 and piece 2. And the lineup is John McLaughlin acoustic guitar, Jerry Goodman violin, Dave Liebman flute, Charlie Hayden bass from Ornette Coleman's group, Mal Lakshmi on tambura, Ayatu Morea on percussion, Badel Roy on tabla, and then Billy Cobham on drums. This isn't like the Mavish. Those tracks aren't like the Mavish. They're very acoustic, very low key, modal, very influenced like by In a Silent Way, but down a more Indian route. And those tracks are very, very important, I think, in terms of you really hearing him bringing in the Indian influences into his music. So yeah, that's the his third album. Those first 3 albums are sort of essential purchases, I think, if you want to understand John McLaughlin, especially if you got to the Mavish Nux, you need to have those albums. I've pulled out a few other albums around this time that are so important that you might want to check them out. One is Supernova, which I have got and I couldn't find. It's back here somewhere. Supernova by Wayne Shorter. And this is almost like a free jazz album. It's very exploratory. You've got John McLaughlin and Sonny Sharrock, the free jazz guitarist, together on that album. That's a really interesting album. Here I've got, there's 2 albums on this, but if you could see the bottom one here at the bottom, which is Miroslav Vitous, Mounted in the Clouds. Very free album. Very exploratory, incredible guitar solo on Freedom Jazz Dance by John McLaughlin there. Another one would be Where Fortune Smiles, which often gets sometimes released as a John McLaughlin album. I don't believe it was a John McLaughlin solo album. It was much more collaborative with is it John Sermon? I can't remember now on there. But Where Fortune Smiles is well worth checking out. This is an absolute masterpiece. Escalator Over the Hill by Carla Bley. This one is a triple album, like a conceptual, progressive, avant-garde jazz rock album. And John McLaughlin's really featured on here in a band which also includes Jack Bruce, who's singing, Paul Motion on drums. If you're into John McLaughlin and want to see another side of the fusion thing he's doing, round about the same time he's doing Tony Williams' Lifetime, check out the tracks on here. I've always thought this is incredible stuff on here. And then one more session appearance for him, which is this Joe Farrell Quartets, and John McLaughlin plays on 2 tracks on here. One is called Motion, which is like a free jazz track, but he does a version of Follow Your Heart, which is in my top 10 John McLaughlin performances. Follow Your Heart appears on Extrapolation. It also features acoustic version on My Goals Beyond, but my favourite is without doubt the version on here, which is him along with Joe Farrell, Chick Corea, Dave Horn and Jack DeJohnette. Absolutely incredible John McLaughlin tune. So you have to find this album and then you've got to dig out that track, but yeah, it's well worth getting for that. So at this point, John McLaughlin forms the Mavish Orchestra, and it's incredibly successful. This is one of the things about Mavish Orchestra that often doesn't get mentioned. This is a fusion band which is selling out thousands of tickets for their gigs, and so he suddenly gets to this superstar level. He's sort of a rock star level performer, and if you want to check out my rankings of those albums, then that will give you a much better idea of what he was up to then. But he does release a solo album. It's a collaborative album, which is this one, Love, Devotion, Surrender, with Carlos Santana. This is, if you like the Mavish Orchestra, this is in the same boat, very intense, spiritual, exploratory jazz fusion. I would say that if you go through the tracks, A Love Supreme, which is sort of their version of the John Coltrane, is very intense. A very sort of Santana-y Latin take on that. There's an acoustic version of Naima by Coltrane, which is very much like My Goals Beyond sort of take on that. Then there's the Life Divine, which is like, I always felt like it was like almost like another Mahavishnu track. Billy Cobham's on there, and it's very, very intense playing on that. And then on side 2 is a very long track called Let Us Go Into the House of the Lord. I was never that keen on that track. It's very intense and sort of stays on one level. And then there's acoustic track, piano and guitar. Well, I think John McLaughlin's playing piano, called Meditation. But the Love Supreme and The Life Divine are both really great tracks. And they were both remixed by Bill Laswell. He created an album of Carlos Santana remixes. And if you like that album, it's well worth checking out the Bill Laswell remixes. I'm probably going to do a video at some point about Bill Laswell and get into these remixes as well as his own stuff he's done, because for fusion and prog fans, there's some really interesting stuff there. Anyway, so coming towards the end of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you feel that John McLaughlin's heart is in another project. And he's going to swing back to acoustic music, and he's going to swing even more deeply into Indian music. And he formed a band called Shakti. Again, I would say that these 3 albums, I'm going to grab them all, these 3 albums are masterpieces. I would say if you're into the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you need to get these 3 albums and really get your head into them. A lot of the people who like the Mahavishnu Orchestra find these albums more difficult, because it's basically a trio of John McLaughlin on acoustic guitar. It's got Zakir Hussain on tabla. It's got El Shankar on electric violin, and T.H. Vinayakaram on clay pot, gatam. So it's a lot more going into the acoustic Indian style. So there's 3 albums, and I'm going to sort of differentiate them for you. So the first is this one, Shakti with John McLaughlin. This is a live recording of the band. It's possibly the most intense version of this band, and some of the most intense guitaring John McLaughlin's ever done. It's joy, and what need have I for this is some of the most incredible, virtuoso, intense guitaring he's ever done. It is recorded live, and with a lot of John McLaughlin's and the Mahavishnu Orchestra live albums at this time, the recording quality is a little bit, it's not terrible, it's not brilliant, but a little bit muddy. Nothing to put you off it, but for me, the second album, which is my sort of favourite album of this period, which is that one, Handful of Beauty, is beautifully recorded, slightly less intense than the first album, but you're still getting these really long improvisations, and it really shows the band. So this is the one to go for first. I would say a lot of people really like the first Shakti album. It is really intense. And then the last one is Natural Elements. And what they've done here, this is much, it's almost like it's more commercial, if Shakti can be more commercial. Rather than great long 15-minute tracks, it's all cut down into very short, concise tracks, a lot more structured. But for me, it's some absolutely incredible music on here. So things like Face to Face, Get Down and Shruti, is incredible unison passages between the violin, the guitar, and the drums. And there's certain points where you can't tell whether they're improvising or it's all structured, because John McLaughlin sounds like he's soloing, but the tabla is mirroring it exactly. And there's a lot of the sort of conical vocal improvisation on here. So I love this album. It's different to the other 2. And so really you do need to get all 3, because you've got the incredible intensity of the first one, followed by the sort of perfection and beauty of the second one, and then this sort of almost like pop version. That doesn't describe it at all, but this sort of more concise, cut down versions of Shakti. Get myself in, and not trying to explain music. It's always very difficult to do that. So I think with with Shakti going, he'd upset the record company, he'd upset the fans who loved all the fast guitar playing. So in 1978, he comes back with this album. Now this is his first of many albums where John McLaughlin sort of looks back on what he's done, and he invites lots of musicians in to play with. He does this every now and then, sort of where he looks back on his career, and he brings in certain guests. This album, Electric Guitarist, is like that. It does feature some of my favourite guitar playing, and this is something about John McLaughlin. I love the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and I love the early albums like Devotion. I love the music on those, but if I'm going to listen to his guitar playing, there's different albums, and for me, Electric Guitarist contains some of his best guitar playing. The lineup is incredible. So it opens up with New York on My Mind, which is John McLaughlin, Billy Cobham, Jerry Goodman, Stu Goldberg, all ex-members of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Stu Goldberg was in a later version, and then you got Fernando Saunders on bass. So it almost opens up with a revamped Mahavishnu Orchestra, but New York on My Mind is a much more subdued tune. And then you get the track Friendship, which is with Carlos Santana. You've got Narayana Michael Walden from the Mahavishnu Orchestra. You've got Tom Costa on organ, Neil Jason on bass, Amanda Perazza on congas from Santana. So that almost points at the Love Abdosha and Surrender period. And then you've got Every Tear from Every Eye, which has got John McLaughlin, David Sanborn, Alfonso Johnson, Patrice Rush and Tony Smith. This is almost like pointing to what he's about to do next with his next band. On side 2, you flip it over and you get John McLaughlin, Chick Corea, Stanley Clarke and Jack DeJohnette. Well, of course, Chick and Jack are from the Miles Band, and they're doing a tribute to John Coltrane, and it's a really incredible piece of music called Do You Hear the Voices That You Left Behind, which has sort of got that sort of Coltrane, giant steps changes. They're all playing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. John McLaughlin's playing very fast, intense sort of post-bebop Coltrane lines on guitar, but with thick distortion. Incredible playing on that. And then you've got Are You the One with John McLaughlin, Jack Bruce, Tony Williams, which is pointing to the second Tony Williams Lifetime album, Turn It Over. Again, that I absolutely love that tune. Tony Williams is incredible on it. The interplay is amazing. You really get to hear the magical chemistry between Jack Bruce and John McLaughlin, which of course goes way back to the early 60s. Then you get Phenomenon Compulsion, which is a duet between John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham, really pointing to the sort of duets that they did on Between Nothingness and Eternity live. John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham would always go off on a sort of, almost like John Coltrane would do this, on a sort of free exploration of just drums and lead instruments, and they do that on here. And then it finishes off with a version of My Foolish Heart, a jazz standard, which is almost going right back to the beginning for John. But yeah, I've talked about this album a lot, and I really do like that. It's a great album. Off that album, he forms the One Truth Band. Now, the One Truth Band, if you check out the live videos, I believe was one of his great bands. Nearly up there with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, incredibly virtuoso, incredibly intense. This album doesn't quite represent that. And this album's got some of my favourite John McLaughlin, and it's got some of my less favourite John McLaughlin, let's say. There's a track on here called Love and Understanding, which I don't know if it's John singing, but there's somebody singing on it. It's pretty hard to listen to that. Guardian Angels sounds like the stuff he's going to be doing with the guitar trio. There's a track called Miles Davis. But on Electric Dreams, Electric Size, Desire the Comforter, The Dark Prince, Unknown Distant, and the track Miles Davis, it's absolutely incredible music. You know, on one of the tracks he does a really amazing banjo solo, if you can believe that. But again, on The Dark Prince, you hear that ultra fast Coltrane changes and John McLaughlin just playing some of the most virtuoso guitaring you've ever heard. And often when someone asks me, you know, play me some John McLaughlin, rather than playing the Mahavishnu, I'll often play them the Dark Prince off this, because it really does show what you can do on guitar. It's incredible guitar playing. Around about this time, it's not a solo album, I thought I'd mention, around about this time he forms the trio of Doom with Tony Williams and Jaco Pastorius, which on paper, should have been one of the great fusion bands of all time. In reality, it sort of crashed. They recorded some tracks in the studio. They went to the Havana Jam Festival and played there, and apparently Jaco ignored the changes on the Dark Prince tune I was telling you about, and he sort of went off on a tangent and wasn't following what they were doing, and they all got very angry with Jaco, and there was a big bust up, and the band never got off the ground. Much later on, they've now re-released the tracks on there. When you listen to them, it doesn't sound like the car crash that was made out to be, and there's some very interesting stuff on here. It's a little bit patchy because it's not finished, but well worth listening to. Again, Tony Williams' drumming is absolutely fierce and incredible on here. It's one of the great moments for Tony, and I think when Jaco's messing them around live, you actually hear how they accommodate for that and the viciousness in which they keep pushing through. Because I think what Jaco was doing was just not following the changes, and the changes were hard, so it's hard to see where you are. But when you listen to how they deal with it, I actually find it really interesting what's going on that. And there's two versions, I think, of that. There's the studio version and the live, so you can compare it. Interesting album, well worth checking out. I pulled this out because it's quite unknown. Fuse One, right? Which was there's a couple of these albums came out around about this time, which create. It's got a whole host of musicians on here. Stanley Clark's on here. John McLaughlin's on here. I think Larry Coryell's on here. It says here Lenny White's on here. So they sort of put a super group of musicians. John McLaughlin brought a couple of tracks in on this, To Whom All Things Concern and Friendship, which is a track off Electric Guitars. Some really nice playing on there from John McLaughlin, and I just thought I'd bring that in because people may not know that album. As the 80s start, he forms a guitar trio with Al Di Meola and Paco de Lucia, and this trio records this album, I think in 1981. I think this was recorded in 1980 and then came out in 1981. I might be wrong. I think it's 1981 now. Yes, probably. Anyway, this album here goes on to be one of John McLaughlin's biggest sellers. This is, for a lot of people, this is where they know John McLaughlin is from, this guitar trio, especially Guitarist. This is so mind-blowing, the playing on here. That it sort of really influenced a lot of players, especially heavy metal players who are into fast guitar playing, to hear, I think, these three guitarists playing acoustically at the speed they are, at the intensity that they do, sort of really impressed people. But yeah, so this was a very important album. I think it sold 1 million copies and sort of put John McLaughlin back on the map, I think, really. For me, again, it's live, and it's a little bit boomy and muddy for me in terms of the recording. This was never my favourite of the guitar trio albums. It was the one that came after this one, which is called Passion, Grace and Fire. But these are both great albums, and I think, if you want to get to John McLaughlin more, you need to get both of them. But this one often gets forgotten. But the playing on here is really intense, and it's absolutely beautifully recorded. John McLaughlin's gone back to his acoustic phase at this point in time. He's now playing acoustic guitar again. You see him do this. He goes from electric to acoustic to electric to acoustic. And he forms a new band. All right. This band features Katia Lebec, who's a classical pianist on synth and piano. It's got Tommy Campbell on drums, Jean-Paul Cellier on acoustic bass, Francois Genot on soprano and tenor saxophone. It's got a lot of percussion, and this is the first album they did, which is called Bello Horizonte, and I really like this album. I think for a lot of Mahavishnu fans, this is where he's moving into the second phase of his career. and I think a lot of the Mavish Orchestra fans who like the darkness, intensity, and the almost heavy metal, this is now sort of really disappeared from what John's doing. This is very light, highly detailed, delicate acoustic jazz on a nylon strung classical guitar. There's some really intense playing here. Tommy Campbell's drumming is really credible on here. Very fast and fluid, but it's very light. This album is then followed up by this one called Music Spoken Here, and they bring the electronics more in this. There's a lot more sort of gated drum sounds, a lot more 80s sounds on this one. I don't like this one so much, and you actually can hear some of the things that he's going to bring into the Reform Mavish Orchestra, which he does in 1984, and he does 2 albums with guitar synth and a lot of sort of gated drums and programming. And this is where you really get into the difficult period for a lot of John McLaughlin fans, and this is where I want to finish this video. So this is part 1. So yeah, we've got up to the 1980s. John McLaughlin's change. He's also going to sort of go off the radar at this point. After he does the 2 Mavish albums, by 1985 he sort of disappears and everyone's wondering what he's up to. He's actually formed a guitar duo with Jonas Hellborg, and he's going around gigging that. I was by this time a massive John McLaughlin fan, so I'm scouring to see him live, and and I'm waiting for albums to come out, and there's not much going on. But he does in 1987 record another collaborative album with Zakir Hussain. This one here, Making Music. Very acoustic, very India, and this is on ECM and a very ECM sound. And this was like the only album that came out for a few years in the 80s, and we were all waiting, thinking what John McLaughlin is going to do next. And I think that's where I'll finish. So yeah, what does John McLaughlin do next? Well, check out the next video and I'll be looking at the second half of his career. And again, thanks for listening.